Hello everyone and welcome back to the Red Path. My name is Dara and today I'm going to be talking about the Manchester GT, a super major that I attended last week alongside many members of Team Red Path and a host of other friends. I'll be talking about the games that I played, the list that I brought and the times that we had there, as well as finishing off on some thoughts about what I'm going to be doing next with the World Leaders. So grab yourselves a brew and let's dive in. Before we dive into this video, I do want to say a big thank you to all of our Patreons. My attendance at the Manchester GT was largely funded by your support, and I probably wouldn't have been able to get there without it. I like to think that by making tournament recap videos like this, I can pay that support back by creating interesting content. If you aren't already a member or a Patreon, check the links below if you're interested in supporting us. You can access some private channels in our Discord, which are quickly becoming quite the think tank for competitive play. Of course, just dropping a like, comment, or subscribe really helps the channel too, and that's always appreciated. But regardless of what capacity you support us, I do just want to say thank you for making this video possible. So, let us talk about the Manchester GT. The event itself was a 5-round tournament which took place over 2 days with a top cut for the finals. It was run by the UKTC, who always put on an excellent show, and it was great to see a lot of familiar faces there. There was a last minute venue change due to the original host pulling out the week before, which caused some minor issues, but the team provided us all with some free swag when we rocked up to the event, which was more than was needed but greatly appreciated. Many people say the UKTC is somewhat like an IKEA tournament, and you always know what you're going to get when you attend their events. Quality tables, which are well spaced, great judges, excellent prizes, and excellent catering. The Manchester GT was no exception to this, and I found it particularly fun to try out their new mission pack, which changed things up a lot. Before I get into the meat of the event, I do just want to take a moment to talk about how much fun I had there. I'm certainly no top tables player, and I always advocate for having a good time at these events, but there was something about the Manchester GT which felt particularly awesome to be part of. Maybe it was the group of us that were hanging out, or the opponents that I played, or the overall vibe, but it really reinstated my love for competitive 40k and the community spirit that comes with it. I hadn't actually been to an event since Coventry, which took place last November, and honestly had been going through a bit of a tough time with my mental health, which had a big impact on my enjoyment of 40k and willingness to participate. I hadn't been planning on actually going to the Manchester GT, but on an impulse I decided just to get back out there and start having some fun again, and I'm very glad that I did. The entire event fully encapsulated what I love about the community and the competitive scene. And even though I didn't do amazing, I finished 3 and 2 overall, I'm seriously hyped to get back into the swing of attending events, and hopefully I'll be able to get to a bunch more later this year. That'll mean a lot more tournament related content for you folks, which I hope you enjoy as well. But that is enough of the preamble. Let us start talking about the list that I brought and the games that I played. I've already put out an army showcase and lore video for the list that I brought to the Manchester GT, but coming at it from a competitive angle, it isn't exactly your stereotypical World Leaders list. Those of you who've been here on the channel for a while know I'm a little bit masochistic when it comes to list design, and I've been on a run of playing lists without NONGRON, or as we call them, NONGRON lists, since the LGT. I built a list for Manchester which leans into my slower, wave-driven style of gameplay while keeping in mind some of the main bullies in the meta, namely Custodes and Necrons. The foundation of the list was structured around previous similar iterations, and I workshopped it over 2 months or so in our Patreon competitive Discord channel and in practice games. I found it had a lot of good answers to Custodes for the most part, and while it had a tougher time into Necrons, it did still have a game plan. I also figured that by going wider in the list design, I'd be able to have some play into MSU Eldar builds and other high unit count armies. The list starts with a Demon Prince on foot with the Helm of Brazen Ire, which halves all damage. This guy is functionally the linchpin of the list, and the rest of the army was built around him, with these abilities in mind. For those of you who don't know, he gives an invulnerable save aura to nearby infantry, 5++ if you don't have an invul, or boosting existing ones to a 4++. This is naturally particularly potent on 8-bound varieties who can castle and play around the prince, becoming much more difficult to remove. It shines in the Custodes matchup particularly, where units like Exalted 8-bound can become functionally as resilient as the Custodes themselves with the 4-up invuln and 5-up feel no pain. Additionally, if you really need an infantry unit to survive and they don't innately have an invulnerable save, you can pop the go to ground stratagem for 1 CP when they're near the prince, which gives them a 6-up invuln, which then boosts to a 4-up. So following on from the prince, we have Invocatus, Khorne and the Berserker Glaive Master of Executions. All of these units are fairly self-explanatory. They show up in the majority of competitive lists and find a solid home in mine. Invo's scout moves are always invaluable, but particularly so in this list, which has some interesting options when it comes to selecting those scout targets. Moving into the battle line, we have 1 unit of 10 Berserkers and 1 of 5. Depending on the matchup, Mo and Khorne alternated between who was attached where. In games where heavy targets needed to be ripped down, Khorne joined the 10, whereas in combat-centric games, I put the Master of Executions with them. Then comes a unit of 10 Jackals and a unit of 20 Jackals. The 20-man is the spice here, and you can probably imagine the tar pit that they became when, next to the prince and with go to ground up, they end up with a 4-up invuln and 5-up feel no pain. They become ridiculously hard to shift, and make for an excellent unit for Invocatus to scout in the first turn, since you can ram them forward and totally bog down an opponent in their deployment zone in turn 1. Honestly, they were one of my all-star units all weekend. The rest of the list is fairly straightforward. We have 3 squads of 3 8-band and 1 6-man block of Exalted 8-band, as well as a unit of Spawn and a Rhino. The MSU goes quite strong here with the capacity for the roaming 8-band units to harass the enemy flanks and increasing my options for scout choices in turn 1. The Exalted 8-band brick are typically the key component of the Wave 2 push, arriving alongside the Prince to deliver a hammer blow and be incredibly resilient on the hitback. Spawn are of course wonderful, doing a variety of odd jobs and being a nuisance to remove. Overall, the list wants to play a staggered assault, early pushes coming in from 8-band squads and the like, and a second wave of punching power involving Berserkers, Exalted 8-band and remaining elements. Of course, this didn't always play out exactly as planned in every single game, but the list has enough tools to also be able to react interestingly in changeable situations, which is typically how I like to play the game. But how did it do when it was put to the test? Let's get into the games and find out. Game 1 sees us playing Priority Targets, Chilling Reign on a Dawn of War deployment. Priority Targets is an interesting one, heavily favouring the player who goes second due to the possibility of scoring very high in the bottom of the final turn. And Dawn of War deployment isn't ideal for me, since it can be a little bit harder to play out of a triangle of control, which my list definitely wants to do. However, I've paired into a particularly interesting list piloted by Dylan. He is bringing the Blood Angels, and when I open this up on BCP, the first thing I'm seeing is Chaplain, Jump Chaplain, Lamarties. I know exactly where this is going, and we affectionately dub this army the Vatican's army. There is a pair of Baal Predators and a Pred Destructor too, as well as ancillary units in the form of Jump Intercessors and the like. But the meat of the list is 4 Death Company squads, a mix of Jump and Foot Infantry with 1 massive Jump Pack unit led by Lamarties. Blood Angels can be a tougher matchup for the World Eaters, especially a list that leans this heavily into Death Company. They will make mincemeat of pretty much everything they touch, and Blood Angels have access to Fight on Death stratagem, which makes trading extremely complex, especially when they outnumber our units. The Baal Predators are also extremely deadly with quite good range and maneuverability, so they pose an additional problem. Going into this, I know I need to shut those assets down ASAP or they will ruin my game plan. So I end up deploying pretty aggressively, since aside from the Predator Destructor, Dylan can't easily reach me in turn 1. He cleverly uses an Infiltrating Lieutenant to block a chunk of my scout moves, but I have a strong setup in the middle of my deployment zone from which I can push out and get some early positioning. I don't really want to go first here, preferring for Dylan to be forced to push out and come to me. In a melee on melee game like this, generally the first person to push hard is at a disadvantage, since it allows the opposing player to react with a lot of information in their hands. However, I do end up going first, and as I mentioned, several of my scouting units are tied up and blocked by that lieutenant, but I use Invocatus to scout out the Exalted Brick and the Jackal Tar Pit. The Exalted push for a Baal Predator that he's deployed forward, and the Jackals push for positioning on my safe objective. Getting a nice card draw on turn 1, I go with Advance and Charge, and I end up being fairly aggressive here. I know that I absolutely need to remove the Baal Predators very quickly, so I rush the Exalted into one of them, weathering some Overwatch and losing a single model. One of my 3-man 8-band squads chases down that lieutenant since I know he's a real nuisance, and the rest of my army pushes up to the midboard, positioning and staging for a retaliation strike. My plan here was to present some problems to Dylan, locking him in his deployment zone for a turn and allowing me to posture, to then hit him with a hammer in my turn 2. This works fairly well. The Exalted mulch the Predator and tag into a Rhino, while the 3-man 8-band unit easily wipe the Lieutenant and pile into a Rhino on his far side of the Big L ruin. This forces the majority of Dylan's resources to have to focus into these 2 units in the first turn, meaning I end up with a lot of information about his disposition. He does pick up both my Exalted and 3-man 8-band squads, which may seem like a bad trade in terms of points, but it has kept him in his deployment zone for a turn, locking him out of primary score and keeping him boxed up for what I want to do next. Turn 2 gives me a bit of a rough draw with capture enemy outposts and investigate signals, neither of which are particularly achievable, but I know the game is in my hands here and I push aggressively into his deployment. The Master of Executions and 10 Zerks jump out and ram into his lines alongside my Demon Prince and the Jackal Tar Pit. I string the Jackals across and through his Big L ruin, tagging into a Rhino, a 5-man deck company squad, and Lamartis' squad who had killed the Exalted in the previous turn. I also charge the Prince and the Master of Execution squad into the Lamartis brick. And this is where things get a little bit weird. Knowing that he can fight on death, I activate first with the Master of Execution squad to cleave up some of the Death Company, knowing he will have to split his fight on death attacks across the 3 units that I've sent in. However, my squad sort of whiffs it, killing Lamartis and only 4 Death Company, who also whiff the fight on death and don't really do a lot of damage back. The Prince picks up another few of the Death Company and the Jackals drag down 3 of the Foot squad on the far flank. This ends up working out pretty well for me, as there's now 2 Death Company squads and a Rhino with more Death Company inside, all tied up in combat. So it poses a big challenge for Dylan's hitback, since he is forced to disembark the Death Company squad inside his deployment zone again and run them into the Jackals, who, thanks to the 5-up invulnerable save from the Prince, managed to persist for quite a while. My Prince does eventually die from weight of Inferno pistols, but he takes an awful lot of sponging before going down eventually. The Mo squad is very problematic for Dylan due to the fights first, and he elects to cleverly ram it with a Rhino to bog it down, which does work as the Mo squad fails to destroy the Rhino here. Elsewhere, the 2nd Battle Predator and the Pred Destructor put some hurt on some of my midfield squads, and an ingressed squad of Jump Marine rush my home objective and body the Jackals camping there. Body of turn 2 leaves the game in a little bit of a weird position for me. So my retaliation to this has to be quite careful and controlled, or else I end up losing the game. I send Invocatus to flush out 3 Inceptors that dropped on my left flank, and the Battle Predator gets rushed by some Spawn and 3 8-band. Karen and the boys I'd left lurking near home so they could run and take care of the Marines that are now squatting on my home field's objective. Mo and the boys keep being a nuisance here, eventually getting onto his objective for capture enemy outpost. The Jackals manage to barely hold on for another round, keeping the last of his Death Company tied up there for a turn, and at this point we kind of start working with minimal assets. Dylan drops in his 2nd squad of Assault Marines, but they don't really have anywhere to go other than an objective. He pushes out finally into the midfield, rushing the central point, which he easily seals from the spawn there. However, the closing turn of the game sees me mop up these last few elements and run down the remainder of his army. It ended up being quite a close one, with a particularly strange mid-game board state, but I was able to pull the win out of the bag, scoring a big 91-48 for game number 1. Game number 2 presents us with a bit of a curveball mission. It is a supply drop on Search and Destroy, and for those of you who don't know, in supply drop, the home field objectives score no primary, and the 3 midfield objectives progressively disappear from turn 3 onwards, with each remaining objective being worth steadily more points. The final one is worth 15 points in turn 5, which is a massive swing, and this objective is determined randomly. I am playing into James with his beautiful Eldar MSU list in this game. It's a very, very tough matchup for me, especially on this mission. While my list is wider than the average World Leaders list, MSU Eldar is still incredibly difficult to keep up with, and James has brought all the good stuff. He's got Hawks, Fire Dragons, Shadow Spectres, D-Cannons, Falcons, you know how it is. I end up going first here, which isn't ideal for this mission, but I just decide to send it pretty hard, and I rush his lines with 3 8-bound and the Jackal Tar Pit. I posture the rest of my army in a very aggressive position and end up picking up a unit of Harlequins, a Scourge unit, some Shroud Runners with my first charges, as well as tagging into a unit of Hawks with the 8 band. I have a somewhat hilarious time in James's first turn as my dice decide to randomly power the hell up and make almost all of my saves. Thanks to the nearby Demon Prince and go to ground, my Jackals simply flip the bird to most of his firepower, taking a huge amount of damage before they eventually go down. Similarly, the 3 8 bound who rushed tank 3 D cannons and some fire dragons before eventually biting the dust. And unfortunately, a crucial rules misplay here costs me significantly. James guns into my Demon Prince with 5 Scourge Dark Lances, and we both slip up here, forgetting that their d6 plus 2 damage does not work like Melta, and the entire roll is halved. We end up adding the plus 2 damage to each half d6, meaning my Demon Prince takes a lot more damage than he actually should, and he barely dies. Sadly, this mistake is probably part of what costs me the game, as he was positioned to rush the Eldar lines in the next turn alongside some heavy assets in my army. But these things do happen, and it was on me to get that right, so no feels bad at all. It does also take me off primary, as a unit of Warp Spiders have snuck onto the midfield objective, and in the bottom right corner, a Falcon flies down to gun into Invocatus and 3 8 band, along with another squad of Fire Dragons. Hilariously, I only lose 2 8 band here as well. I decide in my next turn to send as much as I can in, since I know if I need to keep applying pressure here. However, losing the Demon Prince puts me on the back foot, since my army castled around him loses a massive chunk of survivability. My cards don't do me any favours here, but I'm able to pick up a few more squads in my turn. Invo and the 8-band champion slam some Hawks and Dragons, while the Spawn kill the Spiders in the middle. And James gets aggressive in his turn too, finding a lot of good angles and unfortunately picking up a decent chunk of my army without the Demon Prince to help me out here, putting me at a massive primary deficit, as he's effectively kept me off that primary score for almost the entire game. Turn 3 onwards sees me playing catch up as much as possible, annoyingly forcing me to dump units on important objectives as they start vanishing. Master of Executions and the boys end up nabbing a couple of squads, but it's nothing important, and James now dominates 2 of the 3 midfield objectives. And as the game moves on, I slowly lose my assets on the final 15-point victory objective. It finishes with a dominant performance and victory to James, 30 points to 76. It ended up being a really technical game with lots of interesting interactions and maneuvers, and I really enjoyed playing against James. He was a fantastic opponent with a lovely synthwave style Eldar army. We had a great chat after the game and throughout the tournament. Honestly, I know people complain about Eldar all the time, but I actually love this MSU Eldar style of play. It makes for a much more interactive experience and definitely requires a lot of skill for the Eldar pilot to work it correctly. So props to James for doing so well with it. The final game of day 1 is an absolute belter. We are playing Purge the Foe on Sweep and Clear, meaning objectives sticky and points go for killing enemy units. There's 2 armies you don't want to play on this as world leaders, Knights and Custodes, and I'm playing into Imperial Knights. My opponent Chris is such an amazing dude. He brings great energy to the table, and his Knights army is a lovingly converted looted orc one. Straight away, I know this is going to be a really fun game, as Chris is the kind of guy who matches my energy and then raises it. The key to beating Knights here is ensuring they're penned in for as long as possible, which is going to be tricky. Chris has gone fairly wide with a lot of armigers, Caladius and Canis Rex, and a Castellan which can deep strike uppy downy. Thankfully, I take the first turn here and I do my typical play of sending in the Jackal Tarpit and 3 8 band. The Tarpit tags into a Helverin and Warglaive, slightly scratching the paint, and the 3 8 band cripple another Warglaive but don't kill it. Though neither of these die, I'm not fussed since I basically roadblocked most of his army for turn 1. I do lose the Jackals and 8 band through focus fire and combat from his force, but he's been kept in his zone for a turn. My wave 2 sees the Exalted 8 band going in alongside some other resources, and I also rush backwards with 3 8 band to nuke the Calidus, which has dropped in my lines. I know how many points that assassin can score, and there is simply no way I'm going to let it live. This turn works pretty well. The Exalted 8 band pick up 1 armiger and take another down to 1 wound, and then stand menacingly in front of Canis Rex, who proceeds to swat them into a different planetary system. The Castellan comes down in his turn in his deployment zone to clear out some of my push, but I maintain a dominant mid-board state. What follows on from here is more or less me chasing down the elements that decide to push out, but my resources gradually get worn away. I'm very reluctant to commit my Demon Prince here, since Chris will get a ton of command points if he kills him, and I can't risk that. Eventually, Chris is able to break out, but it's a little too late kind of job. My prince eventually comes into tango in the midboard, he bodies an armiger, and he's surrounded by Mo and the boys, meaning if Canis wants to charge in, he'll be threatened, and I've got 2 CP to do -1 damage on the prince, meaning there's always a chance that Canis doesn't get him, even after chewing through the berserkers. The berserkers actually end up rushing and slamming another armiger, and in the dying moments of the game, it comes down to a single dice roll. Chris is down on points, but not by too much. He has managed to eke out primary by getting kill and kill more for most of the turns. All he needs to do is the one thing to tie up the game. He's drawn capture enemy outpost, and his Castellan has dropped in my deployment zone facing my backfield objective, which contains nothing but a single Dishonored. Chris can't shoot him, he needs to charge to get on the point, which will also net him primary for killing. A 9-inch charge with a CP reroll is all it takes, but it doesn't happen. It was a super tense moment and we were both so hyped for it, but I managed to take the win here 95-84. And as we both said, win or lose, it was the best way to end the game coming down to a single dice roll. Chris was an amazing dude and I really hope to see him again at some future events. We move into day 2 and game number 4, and I'm playing into Doug on Votann. It is Scorched Earth and Hidden Supplies, and the layout here means that the central objectives are pretty exposed, which isn't ideal for me. I will caveat this game by saying this. I really dislike playing against Votann. Honestly, I just don't like the army. I think they look silly, and their rules are honestly quite dumb. The judgment token mechanic often means the army is hitting on 3s or 2s and wounding on the same across the board, especially into world eaters with a low model count army, and it forces the world eaters player into some really annoying play patterns. Thankfully though, Doug is a nice guy. His list is a typical Votann good stuff one, tons of units including mass bikes, mass berserkers, double land fortress, a Termi brick, as well as the usual Sagittarius and dudes inside. I do have a win path in this game, but it requires me needing to go first and leveraging my Exalted 8-bound early in the game to rush and tag as many things as possible. Low leadership on the Votann means they're likely to fail 1 or 2 of those fallback checks, which keeps the Exalted safe. Doug has also deployed fairly aggressively, so I know that if I can get that rush off, I'm in a fantastic position where I can take out some key assets and tag a bunch more. Unfortunately, I go second, and Doug is also well aware of the capacity of the Exalted to ruin the game for him, so with a scout move and big push, he manages to cut an angle with the 6 bike squad on my Exalted, and guns them down to 1 model. That bike squad is 180 points, just as a reminder, and it killed almost my entire Exalted 8-bound unit. Fair and balanced. He doesn't really have any other angles on my army, but that is more than enough to put me in a really bad position. At this point, I'm more concerned with getting the game over as quickly as possible, so I can get my army up on the display tables for painting and check in with the homies to see how they're doing. I decide to simply mash W and go for a bunch of long charges and just throw my army at him. I actually hit pretty much all of these charges, sending Invocatus and 3 8-bound into the bigger bike squad, hitting a Sagittarius with Khorne's squad, and 3 8-bound getting a long charge on 3 bikes, with another 3 8-bound charging a land fortress, and the Prince and Jackal Tar Pit go into the other one. I pick up mostly everything here, except the land forts, which are now fully wrapped by the Jackals and the Prince. It's a little bit of a funny moment where things maybe don't look so bad for me. But Doug strikes back well, removing most of Khorne's squad and the bottom 8-bound squads. But he can't do much about the Prince and the Jackals, who persist over the next couple of turns, hammering at the doors of the fort until the Terminator brick comes down and puts a swift end to them. The other land fortress moves up and gets smacked about by Khorne and some 8-bound, but they fail to kill it, while a bike squad ends up in my backfield. I swiftly start getting out-traded, though there is a funny misplay from Doug allowing my berserkers to surge into his ones, causing them to promptly delete each other, thanks to the Votann berserkers fighting on death and having flat 3 damage weapons. Alas, it's just not enough, and I can't keep up with his units. If I'd positioned a little bit more defensively, I wouldn't have lost my Exalted and before they got to play, so that's definitely a big misplay on my part. However, trading efficiently and correctly into Votann is very difficult for World Eaters since their units are, by and large, very undercosted. The game certainly was not a quick one that I'd been hoping for, running right to turn 5 and finishing with a win for Dog 59 to 84. The loss to Votann was a little bit demoralising, but my low spirits were rescued in a big way by my final game. I'm playing into Miles, longtime fan of the Red Path and running an absolutely maniacal World Eaters list. All my opponents in Manchester were great people, but Miles definitely takes the top spot, bringing amazing energy to the table, and the game which followed was probably one of my all-time favourites in terms of banter and sheer madness. Miles' list was a brilliant take on the World Eaters, running NONGRON, Khorne, 60 Berserkers and 40 Jackals. That's it. Pure power and bodies, and just so cool. It plays a really strong primary game into most enemies, dumping tons of OC and midfield points and baiting out swathes of Blood Surge rolls. I actually really love the concept. Mass Zerk spam is something which people are maybe sleeping on, since it presents a complex problem for the opponent to solve. However, it doesn't do as well into the mirror, since that Blood Surge effect won't really come into play here. For anyone who hasn't played the mirror match, it's a very weird game with bizarre interactions across the board, considering fight on death, heroic interventions, fight first, and all that. Typically, it's a who blinks first kind of game, and turn 2 and 3 are almost always very active and very complex. We were playing a nice simple take and hold, search and destroy with hidden supplies, and Miles ends up going first here. He pushes out aggressively, moving his berserkers quite cleverly, forcing a bunch of difficult decisions for me to have to take. NONGRON is nicely positioned to cast his reroll hit aura to literally everyone without being in danger himself, so I know he's going to be a problem down the line. I riposte with a cautious approach, sending the Jackal Tar Pit and Khorne's 5-man into some berserkers and hitting some of his jackals with spawn and 3 8-band with the intention of killing those jackals with the spawn and piling into the berserkers behind them with the 8-band to then kill them. Alas, even though the spawn rolled up a mighty 16 attacks, I score only 2 hits and kill 1 jackal. The rest of the jackals are promptly butchered by the 8-band. By jackals and Khorne squad tar pit the top mid objective, killing a bunch of berserkers, who then kill some of them on the fight on death, but I take primary there by dumping more than 20 OC on the point. My prince positions in the mid rune alongside some 8-band, again relatively safe but casting out his own invulnerable save aura. Miles goes in for a heavy push on turn 2, and this is where the fun begins. NONGRON flies in to charge Khorne squad, but their proximity to my demon prince and some low rolling on Miles' part means he only kills 4 berserkers, bless up invulnerable saves. The Jackal Tar Pit is picked up by concentrated berserker pushes, but they scratch a few down with the fight on death. In the bottom flank, the 8-band are worn down by the berserkers, taking a good few of them on the way out, and Miles overextends deep into my lines with 2 berserker squads, one going for the prince and another for the 3 8-band next to him. My combat interrupt happens here, with those 8-band taking out a good few zerks, ensuring they survive the hit, and my prince tanks all the damage, taking only a few wounds, and his hitback removes a lot of those berserkers too. Seeing my chance, I push hard in my turn 2. Mo and the boys come out, they charge Ron alongside Khorne and his remaining best boy berserker. My Exalted comes into the picture here, gunning for a berserker squad, and I apply some pressure in the bottom flank area. Invo comes in to rescue the prince and the 8-band. Miles also has fight on death up here, so it is another chaotic fight phase. Mo and the boys go into NONGRON, and Miles elects to use -1 damage here, meaning they won't kill him, but they do take him down to only a handful of wounds. Khorne powers up and slays NONGRON, but he fights on death and bodies a bunch of my berserkers. Meanwhile, the Exalted sweep a berserker squad and Invo rescues the prince and 8-band, who are now positioned to sweep the bottom flanks in the remaining turns. For context, turn 2 took almost 2 hours to complete. It was beyond chaotic and hilarious, and both myself and Miles were in tears from laughter with all the bizarre events happening. The last of Miles' berserkers with Khorne push my Exalted, but I heroic with Mo's squad, who body the berserkers, and amazingly 8 of those 10 fight on death, picking up almost my entire Exalted 8-band squad. Truly a Khorne moment. The bottom flank becomes a brawl between my remaining assets, and my home field becomes threatened by one of his Jackal squads arriving from reserve, forcing Invocatus to U-turn and deal with them. The dying moments of the game sees me finally clear up the midfield with barely any of my army left, and crucially NONGRON does not return to cause me more problems. I'm able to rush his home field and the cards are kind to me, giving me capture enemy outposts and homers in the last turn. The game finishes 77-60 to me, but that doesn't really matter all that much. What matters is that this was quite simply one of the funniest and most tactical games of 40k I've played in a long time, and it left me on a massive high to finish the event. Miles, I'm sure you're probably watching this, so thank you again for a truly memorable game of 40k. I hope we can catch up again at a future event. As an aside, for those of you watching the lore video of my Manchester army, you can imagine the ramifications that had for my headcanon, this being the final game, but more on that another time. So the Manchester GT finishes with me going 3-2 with yet another non-Gron list. Overall, I was reasonably pleased with my performance. It was a tough field and the list certainly wasn't the cutting edge of World Eater's innovation, but I think it performed quite well. I'm not sure if this is the pinnacle of non-Gron lists, and I have some other concepts which I want to explore before moving off the archetype. On that note, we do have a couple of questions from our competitive Patreon group on Discord which I will answer here since it nicely summarizes my thoughts. Firstly, Scott wants to know where I'll turn to now since I've run Ron and non-Gron, and why is it all leading to Demon Engines and Terminators? Well, I'm not thrilled by either of those options, and I still feel like there's scope to explore more ideas with the non-Gron builds. I am also starting to get the itch to play Angron again, but I don't think I'm quite ready to take him back to the table for the next event. One thing I do want to do is explore working a Forge Fiend into the current list. It would be a pretty easy way to swap in one for an 8-man squad, and I think it brings some interesting play to the table, especially in the Custodes game. I'm probably going to workshop this next, and if it's viable I may have to convert up one of the Forge Fiends. But down the line I will be attending No Retreat in September, which currently is allowing Legends. So regarding Demon Engines, that's where I'm going to go hard. If you know, you know. Rin wants to know the pros and cons of each Demon Prince, and it's a great question since they're both super different. The Foot Demon Prince definitely wants to be part of a slower paced list which is built around him with his abilities in mind. With the Helm, he has the capacity to tank serious punishment, and his aura makes units of 20 Jackals incredibly viable. Further, the boost to survivability for 8-bound type units is extremely impactful and dramatically improves the Custodes game. He's a little bit more complex to use, and working out his movement patterns is not easy, but with a bit of practice he can be a linchpin that an army plays around. He does have some natural predators like Mortarion, Magnus and Melta, but he will generally be able to tank damage very well, so he can be a real nuisance. Sadly, his offensive capacity is a bit lacking, so if you're using him as a club you probably will be disappointed. He's not going to do massive damage, he's there to help you absorb enemy firepower. Compared to the Wing Prince, he definitely has a higher skill floor and ceiling. The Wing Prince, on the other hand, is kind of the polar opposite. You'll never build a list around him, but he is the perfect addition if you've got a few hundred points that you're not sure where to put. With Deep Strike built in, he is an amazing tech piece for causing havoc in the backlines and works very well with either the Berserker Glaive or the Helm enhancements. Personally, I found him useful when I ran him, but I did prefer the Footprint since it catered more to my personal playstyle. He's a bit more of a one-trick pony, but it's substantially easier to play in comparison, requiring less complex movement and positioning to get benefits. I also think the Wing Prince is slightly better when paired with Angron compared to the Foot Prince, but he does have a place next to the Primarch as well. With the Helm paired on either, an opponent will typically struggle to deal with both Angron and the Prince in a single turn, so if you play aggressively with these assets, you'll likely have one left when the turn flips back to you. As our faction enthusiasts are really pushing innovation at the minute, lots of people are starting to explore the Prince datasheets, and I'm happy to see it. I'm looking forward to seeing what comes out of the woodwork in the next couple of months. As for me, I am planning on attending another major in June if funds allow. Most likely I'll be running some variation of non-Gron again, but we do have a balance update coming within the next couple of months, so it could change my mind. I feel like I'm getting close to finding my definite list for non-Gron, and Manchester helped a lot with working out the ideal format. If the balance pass is kind and frees up some points, I think there's real scope to building an incredibly potent non-Gron list, but for now I think it is a little bit of wishful thinking. There's still lots to work on, but I'm closing in. Of course, this couldn't have happened without the support from our wonderful community, so once again, thank you all so much for getting me to Manchester. I'll keep making tournament reports for as long as I can keep going to them, so if you want to see more of this and can support us, do check out our Patreon link below. we're reinvesting that support into the channel, subsidizing our tournaments and upgrading our content, so it's going to a good place. As always, liking, commenting and subscribing is the best way to help us reach a wider audience, so make sure you do that too. And if you want to ask me further questions or join the conversation, check out the Discord link in the description below. For now though, this has been the Manchester GT Tournament Report. I've been Dara and you have been watching The Red Path. Until the next one folks, stay healthy, stay safe, and kill, maim, burn.